Welcome back to The Next Big Move with Mila. On this week's episode, we are joined by Dr. Ágota Szabó, board governance academic and international board advisor. Thank you, Dr. Ágota, for joining us this week. I would love if you could do a brief introduction to you, and then we'll just get the conversation going.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and hopefully have a nice conversation together. So my name is Ágota Szabó. I am a board governance academic. And for people who don't know what board governance is, technically I am studying what executive and non-executive directors are supposed to do, how they are supposed to do their work, how they can be more effective, how we should select executives. So everything that's happening in the boardroom and behind the scenes is my job, both from a research perspective and also as an advisor. So I really try to put theory into practice and practice into theory. Two things complement each other. So I'm either in the boardroom for research or because I'm coaching, evaluating, doing a workshop. So the last 13 years of my life is literally dealing with CEOs and non-executive directors on a daily basis, let's say.
And how have you found that? Is that something that you, first of all, studied for? Is it something that you had a passion for? Like, how did you get into board governance?
So I had a classic business administration degree in the Netherlands at Erasmus University, where I had a very nice professor in my last year who was teaching corporate governance. Mm-hmm. And before, I have never even considered going into this direction. I really liked strategic management. Mm-hmm. I picked global business and stakeholder management as my major. I thought I will work for an international company, strategy advisor or director eventually. But then I loved everything we did in that semester on boards, governance, leadership, power. I'm very much interested in the human side of governance. So not the compliance, the legal side. That's what the lawyers need to do. But really on power. Who gets onto boards? Why do they get? Is there a hidden agenda? And how do you make a board of work, especially if there are a lot of egos clashing in one boardroom? So that came as a very interesting moment in my life when I realized, okay, I'm really going to be derailed from what I plan to do. And I started doing that. I started lecturing and doing my PhD in board governance. I did partly in the Netherlands at the VU, the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and partly at the George Washington University in DC. So I was studying two types of board structures. One is that very common in the Netherlands and Europe. That's what we call a two-tier, when you have a separate executive board and a separate supervisory or non-executive board. And in the US, they have the complete opposite. They have a one-tier board where you just have one board of directors, where you have executives and non-executives. So completely different dynamics, completely different roles, responsibilities. So in my PhD, I was studying how do you succeed in these different board structures, which really helps me now, because when I go as an advisor or even a researcher, I understand both structures in a very thorough and detailed way, so I can immediately switch between the board structures. And so I was inspired by a professor. That's how it started.
And do you think that you mentioned the US and the Europe an approach? Do you think that they both work based on the culture? Like you said, your approach is more from the human perspective. So are they set up because of the socials, the way that, for example, the US is set up and Europe is set up? Do they work because of that dynamic?
Yeah, so when I was doing my postdoc in the US, I was asked to talk a lot about what we do in Europe. So how do we see a role of a non-executive and why we think it's necessary to have a separate board? It was really hard to convince the students who only knew one system and they thought that was the only way of working. I mean, it makes you look at governance from a fundamentally different perspective. In Europe, what you do is that you want a separate independent supervisory board who says our job is to supervise and advise and coach and check what the executives are doing. While in the US, they say the non-executives are also advising and supervising, but they can also actually get involved in running the business. And I think that's more the American culture
Yeah.
that does not want this oversight role, but they want non-executives, but who can also actually contribute to the success of the organization.
So like more of a collectivism approach to governance in the US.
Yeah. Well, collectivism, maybe it's a strong word, but they like to have one united board
Yeah.
because they feel like then everyone gets the same information at the same time. They are all responsible for the decision making. So it's just a different way. It's not better or worse. Although, if you ask Europeans, they would say we have a better system simply because how can you be an independent supervisor if you are on the board? So that's how our European values of governance is. But
Yeah.
yeah, the American one takes a more business-like approach, and they just want to say, okay, we are one board with different roles and functions. Yeah.
Yeah. And how is that translated in what you do now? I'm guessing your entire career with teaching as well as board governance and advising boards and basically how to be more effective, or is there more to it than just that? Because full transparency, I don't know a lot about governance other than what the word means and its in its ethos of what it's meant to do. So I think seeing how somebody maybe potentially can go into university and then make a career out of that, be interesting to see and hear what you do on like a day-to-day now as well.
Yeah. So technically, if you want to be part of a boardroom, you either study business or
Mhm.
specific areas of business. So then you're also hired for the specific positions like finance, risk management, marketing, etc. Or you study corporate governance and you go from the legal side. So the
Mhm.
compliance part, that's another way that every organization needs when they talk about governance. But governance in general is the systems, the structures, the reporting lines you have in place
Mhm.
to run your organization. And having good governance is not a goal on its own. Like they see it, it's ticking the box, we meet all the governance guidelines. No, you need good governance in order to have a successful and effective organization. So good governance is a tool, it's a
Mhm.
starting. But if you don't have good governance, let's say you have a not effective supervisory board or there's no transparency in the decision making processes, that can really destroy the long term survival of your organization. Or that's when you have those fraud cases, or you're not ready for a crisis, or let's say something happens to the CEO and the board doesn't know how to replace it, there's no board succession in place. So I had many business people telling me they thought governance was a kind of a luxury item to talk about until they realized when they had a really bad board to work
What it
with
means.
how
Yeah.
much it impacted that they could not implement the strategy because the supervisory board just did not understand why it was needed. They didn't understand the industry, the context. So yeah, so the thing is, from governance, you can study from a million different angles. Like there's some people who only study diversity, some people only study the relationship between strategy and governance. You can study remuneration, so how much they should get paid, in what form. So you can spend an entire research career only doing one part. But I'm interested, if I really had to pick one, is the board dynamics.
Mhm.
Power relationship, who is influencing who, how do you enter a boardroom, how do you make sure that you still bring your own self instead of being molded into the team
Yeah.
that's there, the relationship between the chair of the board and the CEO. What do you do if you have a toxic CEO or a toxic chair? How do you kick out non-performing board members? So there's like it's a lifetime that you can study. And in my board advisory work, they hire you in as a governance advisor most of the time. And depending on the issue they have, for example, there's a new organization and they need to find new supervisory board members, then I help them to create the profiles, think
Mhm.
about what kind of message that would send to the board, because your executives and non-executives also signal what you stand for, who you are, what you can expect from those people. So I help with that. I do board evaluation once a year. Usually boards are asked to do evaluation.
Hmm.
And most boards actually want to do it with the help of external who can lead the process. But you can also think of as part of their board training or professionalization that they have a governance workshop. So what I
Hmm.
did recently on board effectiveness, we talked about, okay, what do you do when there's a lot of resistance in the boardroom? More senior or male board members are not really interested in hearing your thoughts on board effectiveness. What can you do? How you can change the language that they can actually understand what you are trying to say? Yeah, my common example is always with diversity, and I warn female board members not to bring diversity in from the philosophy side and why is it important for organizations, because most of the times people will be not interested listening to that conversation. So I say create a business case,
Yep.
and there are different parts of research, like for example you can say as an effective board you identify risk much earlier than other
Hmm.
times. So if you have a chair who's very much worried about risk or board members who are into risk management, you can explain it from that angle. So you connect it to a topic that they are very passionate about. And then you say what we have to do for effectiveness. And of course, you still focus a lot on diversity. But the main theme of your conversation is not diversity, because I think a lot of the board members either have this diversity fatigue. They heard it now too many times. They see it as a burden, and to be honest, people who care about it, they already care about it. You don't need to convince them with arguments. And the ones who don't, your arguments will not win. So you need to be strategic, unfortunately, and you need to speak the language that they understand. So
Hmm.
eventually you can bring those values into the boardroom that you wanted to bring in the first place, but doing it in a way that also go through this
Yeah.
wall of resistance.
So like a message sent is also received, not come immediately with like a negative feedback on it. So do you
Exactly.
find with what you were saying about board dynamics, is there anything that I guess listeners something would be surprised to hear, or is everything sort of how you like my approach to like governance is what you said, that sometimes people, and I guess maybe older generations or more men are not open to hearing stuff about like DEI, so you approach it from a perspective that they would have an interest in. Is there anything when it comes to like power plays that would surprise people or something like that?
I'm not sure it comes as a surprise, because I think what you said, it's a nice summary that there is still, and of course there are always exceptions, but in general, you see there's an older generation who did not have to deal with this issue, and
Mm-hmm.
they have been on boards for 20, 30 years, and suddenly it is an issue. So I think it's very hard to change their mindset or make them open to something that they were really not used to. So I think there will be a nice shift also in leadership and governance when younger generations are entering the boardroom.
Mm-hmm.
And what I try to recommend is, especially to women on boards, that don't try to fight the fight alone. So
Yeah.
if you're the only or maybe two female board members, don't think that you can always make the message clear or you
Mm-hmm.
can win the battle. I really think you need to find allies on the board among the male board members, because there's always male board members who agree with you or think you're competent and want to work with you. So you need to create your own team, your own safety net within the boardroom with the executives or some of the managing directors, etc., depending on the structure of the organization. Don't try to fight it by yourself, because most of the time it really does not work, and you get really demotivated or you feel like I'm not suitable for a role like this. So there are very few people who could make that on their own. So I would say really join forces, find the people who somewhat have the similar mindset, or at least they want to go into the same direction as you by using different tools, and see how you can join in that conversation. And yeah, be part of a lot of the informal conversation. I mean, that's I think the biggest question when it comes to diversity and inclusion in the boardroom is that we might have some boards that look diverse on paper,
Mm-hmm.
but are they really, part of the decision making? So all these women or people with
Yeah.
different background are all at the golf club or at the coffee machine when some of the informal decisions are made. or how you gather information. So really put time and effort into getting to know the other board members, finding different sources of information, and consider informal governance
Mhm.
almost as important as formal governance. And of course, ideally, we would have the conversations in the boardroom, but that's not how it works. Sometimes, there are pre-conversations and pre-meetings, and for you to understand where everyone is coming from, what's their agenda, you need to be much more prepared.
I guess it also is like, even if things get decided on like company time, there's still people who have personal friendships or relationships outside of that that could influence decision making or whether someone's involved in the conversation or not. But so having worked in there now, is there any sort of skill sets that you see in governance where executives and non-executives that have these skill sets? I assume, for example, for me, from what you've said, diplomacy and compromise must be one of the highest things that you look for to see if a board will be effective. But is there any other skill sets that you think just a person could possess or train up on to have better success at board governance?
Yeah, I think you have to be really proactive and you have to be extremely flexible and open-minded. And
Mm-hmm.
open-minded, I mean, it might sound a cliche, but you really like the things in the world are changing so rapidly that what you thought yesterday was a good idea, it might not be today. So you also really have to evolve as a board member, continuously learn. So I would say the appetite for learning and also self-reflection, that you're able to reflect on what you have done and what you haven't done and how would you do things different. And I think the other key skills that really comes in is stakeholder management,
Mm-hmm.
because for a long time it was left to the executives and the people running the organization. But we see more and more now that you, as a supervisory board member, also need to understand who are the key players, what do they want. In case I come across them at an event, what should I say, what I shouldn't say, that you're always aligned with your organization's policy, direction, and that also requires engagement and time and commitment on your side, that you understand the organization you're actually supervising. And you might be surprised, but there are a lot of people who sit on boards who actually don't read the documents or prepare for board meetings and have no clue why the executives are suggesting things that they are suggesting. So you also can't give informed advice or
Yeah.
vote on a certain issue.
No, I
So
have
yeah,
had that. Sorry. So I had a few years ago, I worked at a company where a new COO came in, and I could tell she came from sort of traditional banking into sort of digital asset custodians, and you could see that I think she hadn't taken the time to read what the company actually does. So a few times in meetings, you could see that she kind of came out and said things that didn't really make sense, and it kind of alienated the entire conversation because people weren't sure where the mistake was happening, because people assumed that everybody was on the same page and the knowledge base was still there. But I guess that could just be like a dip in communication that that board should have worked on as a collective, rather than assuming everybody knew the same thing. And do you think so, from that perspective, do you think that when board members work on themselves, is this something that they should do sort of on their own time, or do companies usually offer, sort of like you said, board training days or workshops where these skills could be improved?
yeah, it varies. I mean, there are boards who absolutely don't pay any attention to professionalization, and then the board members who are really interested, they are doing it in their own time and using their own money. Usually, if the CEO or the chair is really motivated about it, then they are the ones to hire someone in, let's say, for an afternoon or a board retreat, that you talk about important, let's say, strategic decisions, and you're also going to talk about board dynamics, or when an evaluation is happening. So you really need to have a motivated director to really bring someone into the boardroom like this, who really sees that something is not working, and they said, okay, we need to have some external help. Well, women in general tend to be more interested in trainings because they also feel like they need to prove themselves more compared to male board members.
Yeah.
So it feels like I need to have more certificates and training and proofs of knowledge that I'm able to do this job.
Mhm.
So younger generations are more involved in
Yeah.
trainings, or at least they are more open to have the conversation, what it means to be a board member, and how can I become a better one. So there's also a generational issue there.
And do you think, does that trickle down to the size of the company and the governance? So I'm assuming small startups should have governance from the beginning, but they may not have a budget or even awareness that this is something they should have from day zero. Does that then trickle into well-established and bigger companies? Do you see the same learning curves, I guess? But I guess on a bigger note, they must be more exemplified because you just see in a bigger environment than startups who are like maybe 10, 20 people.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. When does governance comes into play? We did that once, a study with nonprofit organizations. When you start really small and eventually become a more important player, when is the moment you actually start thinking about governance? And there is no general rule. Again,
Mm-hmm.
it was depending on the board members who might have come from the corporate sector, who were already more trained in governance, so they identify things earlier. But there are some larger nonprofits when I think you are large and you are still not doing anything besides the legal compliance part of
The bare
governance.
minimum. Yeah.
Yeah, that absolute ticking the box, but otherwise you never had a conversation about the roles and responsibilities of the individual board members. I mean, it's a number one chapter in every governance code, roles and responsibilities. And
Mhm.
most organizations never have that conversation why someone was invited or hired to a board. So when you join a board, you're thinking, what is my added value here? Because every
Yeah.
time you join a new board, you need to bring a different side of you because you are entering a whole new dynamic, a whole new
Mhm.
organization. So it could be that if you were trained, let's say, in public affairs, and then now enter a board where there are already three board members who are trained in public affairs, that's not going to be your added value. So you
Mhm.
really have to see every single time, why was I invited, or what do they expect from me? Can I really deliver that? Can I live up to that expectations? Am I willing to? Also, people coming from politics or money, they're often invited to NGO boards because people think they can just repeatedly utilize their network to get money, and the case is not true. So at
Mhm.
some point they say there's a limit how many NGOs I can support, or how many times I'm willing to ask people with money to support the cause. So I think that conversation does not happen often,
Mm.
and it's also a missed opportunity because if you would tell board members in the beginning what's expected from them, why they are really hired or asked to join, then you could have a much more honest conversation in the beginning and say, look, can you deliver or not? Why are you joining the board in the first place? Is it for your CV? Is it
Yeah.
because you're passionate about the cause of the organization? Is it because you want to eventually become a corporate board member? So you are training in the non-profit world. I mean, that happens as well with younger board members. They take on unpaid board roles, so eventually they can climb the ladder into paid board roles. So you need to be very clear about the motivation, the underlying reasons on both sides. But yeah, that's an awkward and uncomfortable conversation to have. So that's where most boards already fail, that they don't simply understand what roles and responsibilities are. And the
And that
other
was
common
chapter one of the book.
The other common mistake is that thinking just because you were a talented executive or CEO, then you can also be excellent non-executive director. So you
Mhm.
can go without training into a supervisory board role, which is a complete opposite task in governance than when you were an executive. So there are certain benefits of having executives because usually they can make quicker decisions. They understand where the executives come from. They dare to take the brave decisions because they are used to it. But on the other hand, sometimes they can't take distance. They don't understand they are supervisors. They should not be mingling in the business of the executive. So just because you were trained in one area of governance, it does not automatically qualify you to
Yeah.
become
So,
a supervisory board member. And there are much more trainings for executives and managers than actually for supervisory board members.
yeah, definitely. And do you find, so the flip between the two, is it, have you found that supervisors that go into executive roles find it easier to flip into that, or is it completely two different profiles of people? So like you said, executives probably quicker risk takers, make quicker decisions, but supervisors are there to support. Do you find that the flip, if executives find it harder to be supportive decision makers rather than the other way around, is that something you found, or does that not really have a correlation?
Well, you see more people going from executive to non-executive roles, because as an executive, you're really hired for a specific skill set, or as a CEO, you are hired for a specific reason. Why, as a non-executive, you can be hired for multiple reasons. So executives can become non-executives, but someone who has only been a non-executive director usually cannot go into an executive role unless you are trained for that job. So that shift is happening much less. What I see is that some board members just say, I'm only going to be non-executive, and that's going to be my full-time job. So then you sit on 5-6 different boards, because then you really have the time to prepare and engage and understand the organizations. People who are executives and sit on supervisory boards have the least time, because they also need to run an organization. So they can be beneficial to a board in many ways, networks, understanding industry. But yeah, they probably going to be the ones who have the least time to do the preparatory reading or do anything extra for the organization. So there's a limit how much of active executives or directors you should have on your board. So there should be an ideal mix. But yeah, as an executive, it's really a job that you need to be qualified and trained for. And there are less restrictions when it comes to a non-executive role.
Interesting. And from now, like your years of research, is there anything that you can predict for the future of board governance? Is there something that you're seeing, like we mentioned earlier, like the generational shift, I guess the diversity equalization, if that is happening now? Do you see anything that you think in the next 3 to 5 years we'll see more on governance boards in NGOs and corporate settings?
Well, I think when they ask me this question, I really see a difference between proactive and reactive boards, meaning that there are boards who really start paying attention to their own professionalization, governance, and not talking about compliance, so not just meeting the regulatory expectations, but really thinking about your governance and having the right board with the right skill set. Those boards will be able to really deal with crisis much better. They will be able to identify risk much earlier. So they are not just always running behind themselves, trying to deal with one crisis to another, but they can actually anticipate things. And then you're going to have the second group, the reactive boards, who do not invest in governance. They don't want to understand. They just still work with the old boys network and classic roles. They don't understand that how boards role evolving now, how the world is changing. I mean, just look at technology. But also the regulatory environment is getting stricter, so you have to pay much more attention to that. But it's only one thing you need to pay attention, the legal side. It's very important, but it's just one side. So there will be boards who will just struggle trying to always tick the box, make sure, same with NGOs, try to find donors, and they are constantly running and trying to fill in the forms and prove enough, just enough to get the funding. While other boards, they can show much more advanced governance practices, reach out to different stakeholder groups. So I'm seeing that divide between the different type of boards and the time and effort spent on governance really leading to two different directions.
And do you think that, I know you said like from one perspective, it's the compliance and regulation aspect of it that is the only one. Do you think that on a governmental or like EU level, there'll be any requisite for governance? Just because from a perspective like, and I don't know how much GDPR and stuff like that gets involved in legal, and just the self-reflection of how you are working as a team, and now the mental health and sort of stuff like that, where companies have a duty to their employees, and also ESG and DEI. Do you think there's ever going to be, and I don't know if this exists already, a requisite legally other than compliance regulation that a board would need to put in, and that would kind of force them to be a bit more proactive and self-aware?
Yeah, I think real change can only happen if you want it from the inside. So that's what also NGO board members who I did a study with, they said, you will only really evolve as a board if you want to evolve. So what happens is now in the external environment, we have more rules and regulations than ever before, best practices, and at some point organizations are drowning in them. But legislators feel if they don't push them, and
They will.
rightfully so, the organizations will not do it,
Yeah.
many of them. So it's a tool that they use to force them. And I'm afraid this is going to happen more and more, that you really need to force organization to move in a certain direction. And the other way is, for example, in a nonprofit world, is like donor-funder relationships that they are much more critical. There's less money to donate, and you really want to give it to the organizations that you trust the most and you think will perform the best. And part of that is having a trustworthy board and governance in order.
Mhm.
So I think at some point, your external stakeholders, donors, funders, legislators, they will start setting so high expectations in terms of governance that you need to follow that.
Yeah.
And there are some organizations who already want to do it better, but the number is much smaller compared to the ones who are doing things because they are required to do so.
And just interesting, I mean, I'm not sure if there's an answer to this. Why do you think that external force has to be put on rather than an internal motivator? Is it because it's not seen as like a critical thing, or like business critical, revenue generating, so they're kind of putting it to the side and only doing it if they legally have to? Or is there something else in sort of human nature that people don't want to be self-reflective on what they're doing well and what they're not doing well?
Yeah, I think there is no one answer to that. But I think partly is that if you look at history, organizations did not want to work on governance. They did not find it important. Or the board members who are now sitting there for 20, 30 years, they don't want to care about their own professionalization, lack of self reflection. They don't want to do evaluations. They just find it comfortable as it is.
Yeah.
So you need certain legal pressure to put on boards that they at least they have to start doing something about it. And the second is, yeah, if some board members will think only from a shareholder perspective, and like you said, if it doesn't generate profit, doesn't help you to deal with risk, it almost doesn't go through. So some of these important issues I mentioned before, diversity, you need to make it a business case and say, why is it essential for the survival of the organization? Or how is it going to contribute to cost reduction or revenue generation? So if you phrase it this way and really show how it's going to go, you might be able to expect better responses from people. So, yeah, I think legal pressure, and also until we see a cultural mindset shift, you really need to package things in a board business packaging and say why is that important for your organization. So yeah, I think it's two-sided. The internal motivators are different
Yeah.
than what we would like to see, at least as complementary. And that legal pressure, yeah, it forces organizations to do it. So if you really want them to at least start thinking about something, because I'm not always that hopeful about the implementation. And you can see that there is a decoupling between policy and practice and how it actually gets implemented, or even if it's implemented, it's not implemented in a meaningful way. So
Yeah.
it doesn't really contribute to organizational success. So it means you did not really understand why you had to do it in the first place. So I'm not naive about that, but I think at least if you keep forcing organizations who are really not willing to think about governance from this perspective, it is a start. It's not ideal, but you have to start somewhere. And I mean, legislators have the power to push that start button.
And I think maybe my last slightly controversial question on this is, specifically in the US, do you find that with the current state of the US and their approach to DEI, that they kind of may have set governance back a few years? Or do you think that because of the legal pressure now being kind of put off companies, they'll kind of go back to business as usual. We don't really have to implement things. Do you think that that political influence exists so harshly, or do you think that companies have seen that implementing governance and good policy and best practices actually has made their company better?
Yeah, I think there you're also going to see a divide between organizations, that some will happily go back to nothing because they were already not committed. And it's not just in the US, in everywhere. You see in Europe as well. If you get a bit easier on a certain regulation or there's more time given to implement, they immediately jump on it and they think that, okay, we don't have to do it. But those are the ones who were not committed in the first place anyway.
Like
and
you
the
said,
ones who see the benefits, and you can see some US examples there as well, that they will keep it going, or they might call it different just to be on the safe side, but they will want to use it because they see a benefit, or it's part of their organizational values now, and that's how they recruited people. That's why people want to work for them. So I think there will be companies who will drop under the pressure, but those are probably the ones who also cared less about it in the first place.
Yeah. No, that's just really interesting because I like talking through this with you. I didn't realize how much, from the obviously knowing legal perspectives and like pressure that put on, but even the stability of like, if we're talking from the human perspective of politics and stuff like that, I think certain companies, like you said, if they didn't want to be improving internally anyway, they'd find it as like a good escape route to just say it doesn't work, we've stopped it, up until maybe another political term changes and they get pressure again. But it's really fascinating because I think very few people, unless you're involved in governance on a day-to-day basis or have worked in somewhere where stakeholder management is required, you don't really know how it works behind like a closed door. You assume that the people that are like C-suite and board members should know what they're doing, and you're giving them trust that if you're working for someone like lower in a middle management position, they know what they're doing. But it's really fascinating, and it makes sense actually from the perspective that you're looking into it, like human dynamics, that it wouldn't work brilliantly from the start just through history. And like, it's a business at the end of the day. It'd be different if I guess it was like a family or a friend circle, because you'd all want to work on the same interest and have a shared perspective. Is there anything else that maybe I haven't touched about that it would be interesting to share on the podcast? Or is there so much that we don't have time to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's, as I said, it's a lifetime study, and I think what I've seen is governance indeed a very specific area of organizational success. So when people are trained in business or they are a good CFO, it does not mean that they will actually understand every aspect of good governance. So you cannot assume that people at the top, they're all equally qualified to know what they are doing in terms of governance. So there should be much more time and energy and resources spent on professionalizing the boards. And then I think more questions are coming up about that who do we actually want on boards? Are they in line with expectations of society? We don't want people who just, are there for their CV because it looks good that you're on 10 different NGO boards. So I think there is a slow shift. But it's also such a complicated topic that, there are no like 5-step approaches to fix your governance. Like, I'm always surprised when some consultancy firms are doing a training and they say 5 steps to fix this. I'm like, but every board has their own unique governance challenges. Like, of course, there are some questions you need to ask that are similar, but otherwise it's a whole different dynamic. They are in a different life phase of an organization. We are in a different time. Like, if you had the questions 5 years ago during COVID, you had completely different challenges than you have today. So I always go in, I have almost no standard slides or documents prepared for my entire board advisory career, because every time I go in with an empty sheet and thinking we need to start from scratch, and you really need to see what would help this board, what is the actual problem, because often they think they have a problem and it turns out the problem is somewhere else. And this is a problem just a surface, but it could be much more or bigger or more complex underlying issues that you actually need to solve in order to succeed. So there is no one size fits all, and they say that for governance codes as well, that they don't seem to work because every organization need to implement it in a way that it fits the needs and the features of the organization. So you really need to adapt it to your organization. So it's just a starting point. It doesn't mean that you need to take everything literally sentence by sentence, but you see what are the main ideas and how can we make it work for our own organization. So it's very complex, not easy. That's why you really need people who are constantly training themselves to be better board members and understand how we can be a better or more effective board for the future of the organization.
I mean, I think it's so fast. But again, even pulling it back to like human nature, this makes sense. Like if you want to be like a better human, you want to better yourself every single day. So it works from like a personal but also professional position that I guess you can force people to have governance from a legal perspective and put pressure from regulation, but it's down to them individually if they want it as a person, but also as a company, like you said. But it's so fascinating because I think coming into the conversation with you, I had an overview of what it is, but you don't really realize how much of that is human dynamic as well, and how much human psychology puts a play into a boardroom, removing what they even talk about, just the plays between people. But thank you so much for being a guest. It was really lovely speaking to you, and I've definitely learned more in the last 40 minutes than I thought I would. But yeah, thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, well, that's great. And what I always say, the only problem with governance is that people need to implement it. So governance would be such a well-functioning framework if it was not the human dynamics side that actually hinder the process of good governance. But thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope more people will get interested in how boardroom work and what good governance can do for your organization.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you.